Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the IAM webinar series, jointly hosted by IAM Canada and IAM US chapters. Today, we're going to be talking about asset models and modeling in general in asset management. And our guest speaker will be Stan Coleman of Copperleaf. So before we do that, Stan, if you can move on one slide. Very quickly, our hosts, or your hosts today, as usual, Tom Smith from the University of Wisconsin, who is a director of the IAM US and is a member of the US delegation at ISO TC251, which I'm sure most of you know is the technical committee that manages the ISO 55000 series. And myself, Badran Nayans from Copperleaf in Vancouver, and I'm the current chair of the Canadian chapter of the IAM and also a member of ICTC 251. Tom, do you want to say good morning to everybody, or good afternoon?
Good morning, yeah, good noon it is here in the Midwest. So glad to be here and looking forward to this session on modeling. It's something of a particular interest to me, something I've spent a lot of time doing, so I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent. Next slide. So very quickly, our speaker today is Stan Coleman. Now, Stan I have known for 24 years. We determined earlier today. I've worked with him for 24 years because he happens to work in the same company as I do, which is a first. Stan is, in my mind, the master of simplification, and we'll hear about that today. He can boil down very complex concepts to very simple terms. He is the Chief Technical Officer at Copperleaf, and he has been so for the last 11, 12 years. Before that, he was the head of software development at another Vancouver-based company called Creo, which was sold to Kodak in the later years. Before that, he actually did systems development in meteorology, aeronautics, and defense for a local company here called McDonnell Detweiler. He has a Bachelor in Applied Science in Engineering Physics. And like most people in British Columbia, he's an avid outdoorsman. So actually today, Stan is in the Okanagan, which is in the interior of British Columbia, in a beautiful place called the Kettle Valley, where allegedly it's extremely hot right now. So Stan, thanks for joining us from the middle of your holiday. And if you click on the next slide, Stan, we'll quickly go over the rules for the day. We have a very large audience. There's already more than 230 people online today. So clearly we cannot take verbal questions. You will find a question box in the user interface of GoToMeeting. Please use that to kind of put any questions in that you'd like to ask. We'll try to answer as many of them live. And if we don't get to your question, we'll answer it after the session through email. Please therefore also be very specific because of course we cannot get into a lot of back and forth around the various questions that are being asked. And we'd like to hear from you, of course. Ideas for future sessions, please contact either myself or Tom. And at the very last slide today, you'll have our email addresses. So with that being said, I can now turn it over to Stan. The floor is yours, Stan, and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Badran. Thanks for the introduction. So I hope everyone's doing well. During my 11 years at Copperleaf, I've worked with our clients and our development team to create models for valuing investments and improving decision-making. So I'm here today to share my experiences and learn from your experiences. Here's the schedule for the hour. I'll start with a brief introduction. Then we'll talk about the models that are most relevant to investment decisions. Then I'm going to step through different asset models that I've seen used, moving from very simple ones to more complex ones. We'll pause and take a few questions at that point to give you a bit of a break from hearing my voice. Then we're going to move on to more complex issues around network models and system thinking and understanding how assets interact with each other, talk about how uncertainty can be used in decision making. Then we'll go on to artificial intelligence, machine learning, digital twins, brief summary, and we'll have time at the end for a few more questions. So starting right in, so I've been involved in designing or implementing asset models across many industries: electrical generation, transmission, distribution, gas transmission, gas distribution, water, sewage. And actually, I'm currently working on models for a rail client. And there's no one right modeling approach for every client. We certainly find ways for clients to learn from each other, and both within the same industry and across industries, but each client can be quite different, even in the same industry. You know, things that can make a difference is the quality of data you have access to, how many assets, what your regulator requirements are, different constraints you're dealing with, and as well as even your own internal processes can affect what models are appropriate. The quote on this page came from a client that we were working with recently. And I really relate to this quote because I've continuously struggled through my career with the same issue. And that is, sometimes it's very hard to just get an estimate from an engineer. They always are looking for something perhaps more precise. And yet sometimes that's all what we need. We're not trying to create perfect engineering predictions for all our assets. We're trying to predict the things which will have a material impact on the business. And so our models and our data only need to be as accurate as what the business needs. So there are all kinds of asset models, and there's no way we're going to cover all of those in an hour or even a week. So I'm focusing on models that are relevant to investment decisions. And so the kind of things that are the attributes of those models are, first, the time horizon. So I'm going to talk about models that work in months and years. I'm not talking about models that make second-to-second or minute-to-minute operational decisions. So for example, I won't talk about a model that helps you figure out what unit should be brought online to deal with increased demand in the middle of the day. But I will talk about models that will help you decide if the cost of owning and maintaining those extra units is justified over the next months or years. As we are making investment decisions, all the models I talk about include both financial and technical data. A technical model that just tells you how likely an asset is to fail isn't enough on its own. To make a financial decision, you need to understand the consequence of the failure and the cost of mitigating that failure. Investment decisions are big decisions. Those decisions will receive a lot of scrutiny from both inside and outside the organization. All stakeholders must be able to understand the model, not just the technical wizard that created the model. The stakeholders have to trust the model's reasonable, and generally you achieve that by making all of the details of the model available to anyone interested. It cannot be a black box. And finally, if decisions are going to be based on these models, the models have to be carefully governed. You can't just wake up one morning and improve your model without telling anyone. Any changes need to be articulated to stakeholders, as those changes can have significant impacts on investment decisions. So in order to make an investment decision, we need to understand the value of an investment. When I first joined Copperleaf, I went to meet with a prospective client, a utility in the northeastern United States, and they described their current process for evaluating investments. And it was a fairly well thought out and rigorous process that involved every investment under consideration being scored under various categories, and that resulted in a score for every investment from 1 to 100. But then he said, well, last year, the chief financial officer said, well, our budget only allowed us to do scores up to 66. You know, we could do the ones above 66 and the ones below 66. But what's a 66? What does that mean? Should I be spending more or should I be spending less? I just don't understand. And that really stuck with me, because that makes you realize that to actually make business decisions, a relative model isn't really enough. In order to understand the business impacts, we need to quantify all of the benefits, and that includes obviously financial benefits, but safety, reliability, and environmental benefits. So models that produce relative results can tell us if we've got a bucket of money, which asset of that type we need to invest in first, but it doesn't tell us what return we'll get if we invest in that asset class. It doesn't tell us the relative importance of one asset class versus another asset class. It doesn't tell us if it's worth investing more in sustaining this asset class, or should we invest in other projects in the organization. So all the models I'll be talking about include the quantification and monetization of benefits. So I'm going to start with the most basic model that we have used to help make investment decisions. It's a simple asset replacement model. In this model, the age of the asset is used to determine the probability of a failure. Only a single failure is considered. That would be a failure severe enough to require replacement of the asset. The consequences of that failure are included. This could include safety, reliability, environmental, public perception, or any other consequence. Each of these consequences is multiplied by the probability of failure, and those consequences are added together. The result is the total monetized asset risk. Once we understand the total monetized asset risk, we understand how much risk is mitigated by replacing the asset, and we can understand the value of the replacement. Since we understand the value of the replacement, we can compare that to the cost of the investment, and that allows us to make an investment decision. Although this is the simplest model we have used, it does calculate monetized risk, which some might view as complex. But if you don't monetize the risk, it is impossible to answer the question, how much am I willing to pay? The great thing about this model is that we usually find there is age-based failure data for an asset class. And even if that data is not available, it is possible to estimate failure rates based on the design life of the asset and the surviving population. Now, our very simple but useful model assumed that all assets degrade at the same rate. It was age-based. Of course, that isn't true. So often there will be condition assessment programs in place to assess the degradation of those assets. In such instances, the condition of the asset can be used to create an effective age. Now, rather than basing the failure rate on age, we can base the failure rate on the condition of the asset. I've worked with a number of clients who use such models. For example, a number of our clients in hydro generation use the HydroAMP condition assessment methodology. This is a methodology that was developed by the CIADI working group. And here's a screenshot of an application developed for applying that methodology. You can see that inspection data, test data, and usage data are all used to determine the overall condition of the asset. The calculation of condition can be very simple. Perhaps for a simple asset is based on a single inspection, or it can be quite complex, like in this example. Of course, the complexity of the condition assessment should be in line with the complexity and criticality of the asset. So now, our simple asset replacement model, we replace age with condition, and we get a better model. Of course, to achieve this improvement, more data is required. We need to have condition assessments for all those assets, and we need to understand the relationship between probability of failure and condition of the asset. So making it more complex, so far we have only dealt with a single intervention, just replacement. For many asset classes, replacement is the most important intervention. It's the most expensive intervention. It requires the most resources. It requires the most outages. It requires the most advanced planning and business justification. However, for many asset classes, there are often alternatives to it, such as a refurbishment. In such cases, we now must complicate the models to understand the impact of a replacement or a refurbishment. For example, if we were using a condition-based model, like the one I just discussed, then the replacement would return the condition to perfect, whereas the refurbishment would return the condition to a lesser value. Now we can look at the total value of replacement or refurbishment, where total value here is the blue line shows us all the risk being mitigated if we were to replace an asset in different years. The yellow line showing us the cost of replacing that asset in different years. And all these values are present valued back to the current date, which explains the shape of the curves. And that gives us the overall value of a replacement or a refurbishment. So I think you can see now that this is a pretty powerful model, because first, not only is it telling us the optimal date to replace or refurbish, it's also telling us that the replacement is going to offer more value than the refurbishment. Also, because the model is telling us the value over time, if, say, we don't actually have enough resources or money to do the optimal intervention at the optimal date, it also tells us what value we will get if we intervene at different times. Next slide. Okay, so making it one step more complicated. In the previous model, we introduced the concept of different interventions, but those interventions were impacting a single condition or effective age. Now, of course, we know that's not realistic, especially for a complex asset. What really happens is different interventions impact different failure modes. Replacing the tires on a car mitigates a different failure mode than changing the oil. Now, you could factor the time of the last oil change and the age of the tires into an overall condition score for your car, but it is more accurate to consider each failure mode independently and understand the impact of each intervention on the failure mode. So a good example of such a model comes from the UK, where a standard methodology has been developed for gas distribution networks. I'm showing you here a diagram of the model for just one of the failure modes. This is for corrosion of mains. But you can see on the left panel, there are models for different failure modes like fractures or third-party interference or joint failures. And different interventions will have different impacts on each of these failure modes. So for example, replacing the existing gas main with a new gas main will mitigate corrosion risk. But if that main is in the same location as the original one, the risk from third-party interference will not be impacted. Conversely, adding better signage will reduce the risk of third-party interference, but it won't help with corrosion. So we have to pause at this point and remember that our model is getting pretty complex now. And while it is more realistic, it is only more realistic if we have the data to support that model. It only makes sense to create such a model if we actually understand the failure rates of various interventions and we understand the impact each of those has on failure rates. We haven't said it explicitly, but most of what I've talked about so far has been centered around the next big intervention. And that makes sense because the biggest and most important investment decisions are typically around the next big intervention. But we want to make those decisions in the context of full life cycle costs. And in order to do that, we need to consider the repeated interventions on an asset, not just the next big one, but the ongoing maintenance, refurbishments. And the simplest approach to computing these life cycle costs is to compute the life cycle costs based on rules. These rules could be quite simple. For example, replace the oil every 6 months. Or the rules could be quite complex, and those rules are frequently expressed as decision trees. By including these rule-based maintenance cycles, we are able to understand the full life cycle cost of the asset, and we are able to consider the impact that capital expenditures will have on maintenance costs. So, for example, we can now consider the fact that if we delay the replacement of an asset, that will affect our maintenance schedule, which will in turn affect our maintenance expenditures, which should all be considered when computing the benefit of replacing the asset. And by modeling the life cycle costs into the model, it allows us to build a credible asset management plan that covers most of the life cycle costs of the asset. So up until now, I've been stressing that adding complexity to the model requires we have data to support that complexity. This step is perhaps an exception to that rule. The only data required to implement rule-based maintenance into the model are knowing the rules that the organization follows and the cost of those interventions. Of course, that doesn't tell us if the rules being used for maintenance are actually the optimal rules. So while it's relatively easy to model life cycle costs, what if I want to not only determine the optimal timing of the capital investments, but also the optimal timing of every maintenance intervention? The biggest challenge with constructing such models is that a very significant amount of data is required. Specifically, the data required is we need to understand the impact on failure rates of performing maintenance earlier or later. The challenge is that most organizations follow a fairly standard maintenance cycle, be it time-based, condition-based, or usage-based. If you wanted to determine the optimal maintenance frequency, you would have to understand what happens to the failure rates of an asset if that maintenance schedule is increased or decreased. Given that most of the time our clients follow the recommended maintenance schedule, you end up with a graph with a single data point. And collecting good data for what happens if the frequency is above or below that can be quite challenging. Now, whether or not it makes sense to collect such data depends on the business case. Electrical distribution and transmission utilities spend significant time and resources on vegetation management. And this is an example where there is significant data available that correlates frequency of vegetation management to failure rates. But it makes sense that this data has been collected because vegetation management is a huge expense to these organizations. But if you don't have the resources to either obtain or collect this data, then having a model that supports this complexity is not worthwhile. So this is something that a client told us 10 years ago. You have to improve your modeling skills and your data collection in tandem. There is no point in having an amazing model with no data or having amazing data with no model. Relating back to the previous slide, there's no point in building a model that optimizes maintenance intervals if you have no data to support that. So when is simple good enough? Generally, more expensive assets deserve more expensive models. A multi-million-dollar transformer deserves a more complex model than a much simpler asset like a section of fencing. But you will need to spend money on fencing. And if you're going to spend up a significant amount on these simple assets, it likely makes sense to have a model, a basic model, to help you understand those expenses into the future. And simple, age-based models are helpful, and they can be constructed with a basic estimate of the life and an assumption around distributions. Data almost everyone has access to or can be estimated. And we are making business decisions. So the cost of constructing a more complex model and collecting more complex data depends on how much benefit you can get from doing that. So generally, we recommend starting with a simple model based on the data you readily have available or that you can quickly collect. Then understand the business shortcomings of that model, and then start collecting the necessary additional data and constructing more complex models. Whether it makes sense to add more failure modes, or multiple interventions, or repeated interventions, or maintenance modeling will depend on the asset being considered and what business issues your organization is wrestling with. For example, does the asset class tend to degrade consistently? are there significant different interventions to be considered, or is there a single intervention that dominates? And remember, this isn't an engineering model, it's a business model. So covering 95% of the cases is probably good enough. Is this a short-lived asset and there's multiple replacements need to be considered? And are there significant gains to be made by optimizing the maintenance model? And do you have the data to support it? So with that, I'll pause for a bit and see if we've got any questions.
Yes, we do. So question for you, obviously, Stan, that is, how is the total value calculated both from a risk and from a cost point of view?
How is the total value calculated both from a risk and a cost point of view? So maybe I'll start with cost, because that's the most simple part that people are probably familiar with. So the cost would be the cost of performing that intervention or the series of interventions. Generally, we always, just like when you construct a business case and you use present values, we then present value all of those costs back to the current date. The risk is calculated by looking at the probability of the failures and the consequence of those failures. And this is, the consequence of the failures is perhaps the most complicated part, because that requires you understand the impact of a failure. So obviously different failures have different safety consequences or different reliability consequences. So you have to estimate or use historical data to understand the value of those. And then we apply, typically we do the same thing in terms of, since we're present valuing the costs back to the current date, we present value the benefits as well. Do you think that answered it, or did I miss?
No, I think you're on the right track, and there's actually a follow-up question very much in the same lines. That is, do you compare or prioritize based on the risk mitigated? And if so, is by a risk cost or by a more complex cost of risk and amount of risk dollars mitigated?
I think the answer is it's not, it's the amount of risk mitigated, which is really important. You know, for some asset classes, the amount of risk mitigated is, you know, equal to the total risk, but you know, for some asset classes, it's actually not the same. So to give an example of where it's not the same, I talked about like gas distribution mains, where there's all kind, even if you replace a gas distribution main with a, you know, brand new, perfect new main, there's still many of the risks, like someone putting a track, you know, driving a backhoe through the pipe, remain the same. There's still a real risk. So you have to count just how much risk is being mitigated, not just the total risk.
Absolutely. Tom, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I've got a couple questions. You know, in the one of the first slides, you showed four types of failure, four types of risk. Do you get any pushback from your clients or against monetizing some of those risks? Some of them are very straightforward to monetize. Others, you know, monetizing reputation, environmental impacts, other things, social impact. Some of that monetization requires quite a bit of judgment. Do you get any pushback against monetization, or how does that play out when you actually do it?
Yeah, yeah, interestingly, I would say in the United States, we get more pushback than almost, well, literally every other part of the world. We work in Europe and Australia, and even in Canada, people are more used to the concept, I would say.
Sure.
One of the things we have done, though, for some clients is we just, although we quote monetize them, we still express them as risk units. And so while there is a well-known conversion between risk units and dollars, we don't actually express the mitigated risk as dollars. And I think that's actually a really good idea, because as someone said, I can't take mitigated risk to the bank and deposit it. So it is different than, so saving $1 million worth of risk isn't the same as someone depositing $1 million in your bank account. So generally we express them as risk units.
Okay. So there's an intermediate scoring there that goes on. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense, and that certainly I think is pretty consistent with other things we've seen. So, thank you.
There's a question which sort of ties into this. I think it is, how would you recommend determining the impact, i.e. failure rates, of modifying the intervention, such as extending the interval between specific preventive maintenance procedures?
That's what I said is really, really hard, right? That's where, unless you have data to support that, it's quite, so I think what the question's saying is, I'm doing a maintenance every 2 years, and now I want to do a maintenance every 4 years. How do I understand the impact on failure rates? And yeah, that's what I was trying to say is I haven't run into a lot of clients that have good data to support that. I've seen people construct models, and obviously you would expect the failure rates to increase, but without finding some data to support that, I think the models are a bit artificial. They kind of end up getting tuned to showing people whatever their desired outcome is, rather than being based on actual data.
This Tom. I was going to, one of the other second questions I was going to ask is I was talking with an engineering director at a large process-oriented company, and they don't have all the data that they want, but they're certainly seeing areas where maintenance-induced failures are a problem, and that is they're reconsidering how much maintenance they do simply because they're seeing failures that risk resulting from maintenance as well as risk reduced by maintenance.
Yes.
And yes, clearly that requires some data, but it is turning out to be an issue, I think.
Yeah, but at least in that example, they would understand, they would have data to support how many failures are being introduced by the maintenance, and they can factor that in, so that effectively becomes the part of the cost of doing the maintenance.
Yeah.
The additional failures.
Yeah, collecting that become a priority.
Yeah. I suggest we grab one last question and then we move on. There's actually quite a few questions coming in, but some of them might well be answered by the second part of the presentation, so I'm carefully picking here. This is one for you, Stan, of course. It's actually a statement that you have to agree with or not. Some people talk about risk reduction as if that was a good by itself, but it has to be tied to the ultimate benefits in the world, like human health or environmental reduction. So would you agree with that statement?
Yes, I agree with that statement.
Excellent, thank you for that. So I suggest let's move on to the second part, and then of course at the end of the second part we'll have more questions.
Okay, great. So far we've kind of been talking about each asset individually. As we move on to the second part of the presentation, we're going to start talking about some more complicated issues, because most assets actually reside in a network. And through this presentation, I've talked about the importance from a business perspective of quantifying risk. which requires we quantify the risk of a failure. Now, for an asset with no redundancy, this is easy to understand. For an asset in a network, this can become very difficult to understand. So let's start with a really simple case. We have a circuit between these two stations, and if the circuit were to fail, it would cost us $1 million. So we based that on, how many customers would be out, how long the outage would be, and we were able to do that. But like many networks, we've got redundancy. And the fact is that if one of these assets fails, there's actually no consequence, as the other circuit's completely capable of carrying the load. So what is the consequence if one of them fails? So I've seen models where people count it as $1 million, and I've seen models where people count it as $0 because nothing's going to happen. Well, the answer is, of course, somewhere in between. And the answer depends upon, if circuit 1 fails, what's the probability that circuit 2 is going to be down at the same time as that failure? And if the world was so simple and it was only 2 assets in parallel, life would be kind of easy. You could make a decent estimate of the chance the other asset has failed based on historical asset failure rates. But unfortunately, the world is seldom that simple. And in such cases, usually it's part of a very complex network. And in such cases, accurately understanding the consequence of an asset failure requires some type of network simulation. And so if you have the ability to simulate your network, what you can do is run a simulation under typical loads and understand the overall lossing capability with and without the asset in question. So back to our simple example, you pretend circuit 1 doesn't exist, you run your normal circuits, you run your normal network simulation, you run it with and without, and the difference between those tells you the importance or the consequence of that asset not being there. Now, most of the clients I've run into, so one client, a transmission network client, has done such an exercise to determine the consequence of failures of each of their key transmission assets, but most of the clients they deal with find that too much work. So then you have to come up with some simpler basis for estimating that consequence. And we've typically been able to work with clients to come up with an estimate of that, in the low percentage numbers, which generally the engineers agree is reasonable. And now, so that was talking about just computing the consequence of a single asset. But now I'm going to talk about issues where intervening on one asset actually impacts the cost or the value of intervening on another asset. And I'll start on the cost side and with something we refer to as bundling. So many of our clients talk about bundling as a way to save on resources, costs, or outages. And so again, using a very simple example with 2 assets, we've got asset A and asset B, and we've got that same value versus intervention date curve for those 2 assets. And we can see that we should probably intervene on asset A in 2021 and intervene on asset B in 2024, because that's, considering all the costs and risks mitigated, those are the optimal dates. But what if there's a benefit from doing these assets at the same time? If we do them in different years, we won't get that benefit. So what we can see is if we shift those both to 2022, there's a big cost savings from doing the work together. But by doing the work in 2022, we're giving up value. We're giving up a little bit of value on asset A, we're giving up more value on asset B, but provided the that loss in value is less than the cost savings by bundling them together, it makes sense to do that bundling. Now, I've demonstrated this with a very simple example with just 2 assets. In a system with thousands or even millions of assets, considering these bundling impacts requires some very sophisticated optimization algorithms. And that's on the cost side. But there's also interactions on the value side. And again, try to keep a very simple example. In this example, we've got 2 redundant assets, A and B. Both of these assets are in poor condition. And if either of them fails, then we have $1 million of consequence. And that's accounting for, as we described earlier, we've even accounted for our network model, and we know that if one of them fails, there's a chance the other one will be down, and that's the chance of the failure. So based on that, we have an excellent business case to replace asset A. But if asset B now fails, after replacing asset A, the consequence isn't $1 million anymore, because asset A is now a brand new asset. It's much more reliable, and it's much less likely that when B fails, A will have also failed. So the business case for asset B depends upon whether an intervention has already happened on asset A. And again, I've discussed this in the context of just 2 assets, but as we talk about a full network of assets, the dependencies become very complex. And if you replace, if you replace the word asset A with project A and asset B with project B, and project A is adding a new capabilities to your network, and project B is improving sustainment on some other part of the network, there may be quite significant interactions between the value you're going to get from project B. May well depend on whether project A actually happened. So this clearly makes global optimizations become very complex, because you have to consider all the interactions between all of these various interventions. And this is a good point to discuss why an asset management plan really needs to be a living document, because as demands on the asset changes, as the network configuration changes, as in fact interventions are performed, as unexpected failures and events occur, the plan has to change. The priority and the value of the work changes and needs to be reconsidered. So every model we've talked about so far has uncertainty. There's uncertainty in the inputs. There's uncertainty in the models themselves. Models aren't perfect, as they only approximate the real world. And there is, of course, an uncertain future. What if there's an increase in extreme weather events? What if big projects get delayed by regulatory approvals? What about fluctuations in demand? So communicating the uncertainty in the model to stakeholders can be very helpful. Again, recognizing this is a business problem, one of the most valuable outputs we found are business outputs. And one of the things of great interest to an organization is the uncertainty in spend. Because of uncertainty in the world around us, the spend required to execute our asset management plan will be uncertain. Projects get delayed or accelerated, unexpected failures occur, and projects prove more complex to execute than anticipated. So this graph shows such a prediction. The green line represents the original plan. We'll call this the perfect world if every project executed as the creator of that project thought it might. But then what we can do is look at historic data from similar projects and understand the uncertainty in executing those projects. We then can run Monte Carlo simulations to predict the actual spend and the uncertainty. So you can see For this spend prediction, you see the blue line shows us actually the predicted spend, and the gray shaded areas shows us the uncertainty around that. So we can see that actually, even though the budgeted spend in the first year was 35 million, actually it's more likely we'll spend between $7 and $18 million based on what we historically see in delays of projects. So obviously providing this information to the rest of the organization can be very helpful to help them better understand the chances of overspending or underspending, and so they can make contingency plans accordingly. And of course, you can do the same. I'm showing predictions around spend, but you can do similar predictions around availability or reliability, or of course, resource requirements too. So moving on to the more trendy parts of the presentation. So we use artificial intelligence to solve complex optimization problems that humans couldn't possibly solve using their natural intelligence. Even with our simplest asset replacement model I described, in a network with millions of assets and a horizon of many years, finding an optimal solution requires complex algorithms in order to compute things in a reasonable amount of time. As we make the models more complex and we add in bundling and the impacts of interventions on each other, the problem becomes even more and more difficult, and artificial intelligence is required to solve these problems. We can use machine learning to improve the accuracy of our models. So the performance prediction I described on the previous slide is an application of machine learning. Historical project execution data is used as the training data in order to make predictions about future project spend. Another obvious application of machine learning is for predicting failure rates. Of course, machine learning actually requires having data to learn from. Sometimes people make a distinction between mechanistic and statistical models. Mechanistic models are based on fundamental laws of nature, whereas statistical models are based on analysis of actual data. Generally, I don't find this distinction particularly enlightening. I don't think any models I've seen used for asset modeling could truly be described as a pure mechanistic model derived from the fundamental laws of nature. All of the models I've seen rely on some form of statistical analysis of historical data. Having said that, the more that the parameters of our model are physical, the more we can use to predict behavior for places where we don't have measured data. So to use a very simple example, if age is a parameter of the model, then we can interpolate and extrapolate age for ages for which we don't have data. And this brings us to the digital twin. If we look at the most basic definition of a digital twin, a digital replica of an entity, you can see that even our simple asset replacement model meets that definition of a digital twin. But I doubt anyone would really describe our simple asset model as a digital twin. But as the model becomes much more complex, it becomes a digital twin. And we are seeing people develop very elaborate digital twins, at least for very expensive assets. Typically, I see those digital twins being used for operational issues, and typically not for more long-term investment decisions. But certainly as they are improved, they will become an important tool and potentially a source of data for some of the things we talked about. In fact, one of the questions around can we predict increased failure rates based on what if we were to defer maintenance? And I could definitely see a digital twin being used as an aid in predicting those failure rates. So summarizing, as engineers, we want to construct the perfect model. We want a model that looks across an entire network of assets and incorporates everything I talked about: multiple failure modes, repeated interventions, uncertainty, network modeling, bundling, interactions between interventions. We want an algorithm that will then create a perfectly optimized plan for all the assets. Unfortunately, building that perfect model really isn't practical. Using an analogy, the Taj Mahal is great unless you have to carry it 5,000 feet up the side of the mountain. Then you might prefer a more lightweight residence. So we need to build models of appropriate complexity for our assets, where the appropriate complexity is determined by the benefit we expect to get from building the model. Okay, so thanks for listening, and we have about 10 more minutes for more questions.
Indeed, and I suspect, Stan, that you're on the left side there with your little tent in the Okanagan. I'd expect you didn't bring the Taj Mahal with you.
Didn't bring the Taj Mahal.
How do you explain to a client the confidence levels in the models based on data complexity and model complexity, especially when you're developing a 10 or 15-year plan?
How do you explain the confidence levels? So I'm struggling between, you're saying the clients don't understand the concept, or how do we calculate them?
I think it's the way I would interpret it is how do we convey the fact that your model has a certain confidence level based on the data complexity and the model complexity that you've used.
So I think that's so that's a really good question. I mean, one of the things I really like, I would say our most advanced clients use feedback to their models. So, they run the model 1 year, they predict things like failure rates, and then they actually look at those failure rates the next year to see if the model's, in the right ballpark. And that's when you start really being able to understand the uncertainty in the model itself. I mean, you can understand the uncertainty in inputs because you can estimate them, but understanding the uncertainty in the model itself can really only be done by, comparing it to, comparing predicted rates to actual rates from the model.
There is a question which is maybe a bit tied into this one or has some correlation, and that is, at the early stages of your presentation, you talked about age-based models, which are generally speaking linear. How do you then kind of tag uncertainty on top of that, like distribution of uncertainty for that risk?
Actually, yeah. So even with an age-based model, it wouldn't necessarily be linear, because often people do have historic failure rates for assets, and so when you have that, so the relationship doesn't have to be linear between age and like probability of failure, but also when you have that data, you do get a scattering. Obviously, it's not a perfect line, and then you do some kind of line fitting. But in that process, you actually do understand the uncertainty, at least in predicting the failure rates.
True. And actually, that ties in nicely to the next question: is, can you comment on the risks associated with having a risk model that is not well balanced with the data available? So, for example, started out with a model that is more elaborate than what you can support with your data.
Well, I think you're just, honestly, I think you run a serious danger of just predicting what you want to predict. Because when you have a model that has way more parameters than data, you can really end up making the model do whatever you think is the right thing. For example, I worked with a client who was using a model to predict maintenance intervals. And then when we'd run it, it would, give some answer. And then they'd say, yeah, but that's the wrong answer. We do the maintenance every 3 years. And you're like, okay, so then, we changed some parameters to put it at 3 years. But then you're kind of left asking the question, why didn't I just say do the maintenance every 3 years? Like, why am I having a model tell me something that I already know?
Right. And that ties into the next question. Are the models you have referenced all custom built for your specific assets, or are there models available in the marketplace that can be modified for your specific organization?
Oh, that's a big question. There are, so, I can speak, at Copperleaf, we have a set of standard models for different industries, electrical, gas, and then typically we will start with those models and then customize them to meet. Again, every client seems to have a little bit different situation in terms of what data they have or how it was collected, which often requires like tweaking some of the models for that particular instance. We work with other organizations who have models that they have developed, again, in both gas and electrical utilities.
Well, this is Tom. I would say that certainly from what I'm hearing so far, the modeling techniques are known and described in the literature. The question is how you apply them, and your sequence of application, your sequence of complexity, and the balance between the data and the model, I think is a really important piece there. So it's there are the models, and then there is the business application of those models.
I agree.
The models can be more or less, pieces of them are more or less standard and well developed, and we teach them at the university. But actually, how you do them and what you do with them and how you get the data and so forth, all that is a business issue.
No, I mean, there's nothing I'm describing in this presentation that is, mathematically incredibly difficult. I mean, some of the optimization algorithms, when you get into network stuff, is mathematically challenging, but the actual, handling multiple failure modes and, I mean, that's all been around for, I don't know, at least 50 years. So.
Yeah.
There's a lot of questions around monetization. Clearly, this is a challenge and remains a challenge. So I'm just going to pick one which I think is a good summary, or will allow you to give a good summary. And that is, you mentioned monetization or monetizing safety and environmental consequences. Any advice on how to approach valuation of these things in a way that regulators and ratepayers would consider credible?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, safety's maybe one of the most controversial ones. But if you look, like, I'm going to get the name of the ministry wrong in the US, but it's the Department of Highways publishes a value that is supposed to be used for monetizing a death. So I think last time I looked, it's around $10 million. But you can't make every highway in the country absolutely perfect. You have to focus on the ones that are the most risky, and they publish a number for how you should evaluate that. So I think you can take, and there's actually many of those numbers out there. So I think in terms of selling it to stakeholders and your regulators, if you can say, look, these other organizations are publishing this number, and if we've got some reason to use a different number, then so be it. Let's do that, but let's agree on that. You know, back to transparency. Let's agree on exactly what value we're using.
Absolutely. Tom, do you have any last questions before we switch it over to concluding remarks?
Well, I just say I think that valuation is a serious question, and one that deserves thought. But Stan's answer is right on. There are valuations out there from many different points of view, and some of them are regulated valuations. If you want carbon pricing, is there is carbon pricing in many countries. And whether it's $50 a ton or $100 a ton, there is carbon pricing, and you can take that pricing and put it in the model. You just, I think, have to say what number are you using and why are you using it. But certainly in many countries, $100 a ton would be easily acceptable. So, and risk of flooding from stormwater or risk of power outages, much of that has been quantified in ways that regulators accept. But it takes some digging, and then it takes some thought to put it all together. But I think it's been a wonderful presentation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yes, indeed, and we have kind of reached the end of our hour. So first of all, thank you very much, Stan. That was great. I think there is many questions that we did not answer. Some of them quite detailed, some of them a bit repetitive, but there are just some that we did not get to. So we'll definitely follow up with emailed answers. We will also likely have to put on a follow-on session because some of the topics that we discussed today, I think, are just worth a deeper dive. So, you know, just watch this space and we will be back with more. For those of you who do not know the IAM in more detail, there is, as we said at the very beginning, chapters both in Canada and the US. Please join because it's a great forum for this kind of discussions and to actually develop further knowledge for the community in asset management. You have local branches in many cities, both in the US and Canada. Right now, most of them are a bit dormant because of the pandemic, but in normal times, we would network physically by meeting up quite often. Right now, it's more a virtual exercise, of course, but please join us and help us grow the community. And if you want to click one more, Stan, just very quickly, typically we try to run these webinars on a monthly basis. Tom and I are both kind of keen to hear from you suggestions for future webinars. So please feel free to send us an email with any ideas that you might have or any topics that you think are worthy so that we can kind of plan them for next sessions. And then don't forget, of course, that the IAM has a North American conference. This year, that conference will be virtual. It'll be November 17th to 20th. The call for papers are still open, so we're always keen to hear from you and to kind of get more papers in. And here is the link on screen. So we hope to talk to you again or hear from you again in our next webinars, and at the very least at the conference in a couple of months' time. So with that, thank you again for attending, and stay safe.
Thank you.